Hey ocean travelers around the world, this is Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, the ocean that kept its secret. One flight vanishes, and in its wake, new ocean maps, novel satellite forensics, scattered wreckage, and a mystery that reshaped how we watch the skies and seas. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 pushed back from the gate at Kuala Lumpur just after midnight, local time, bound for Beijing on a routine overnight run. A wide-body jet, a crew trained for long-haul work, and a route flown thousands of times. Everything ordinary until the moment ordinary slipped. The aircraft climbed as planned, checked in with controllers, and tracked northeast toward a handover point over the South China Sea. Then, on a night that began like any other, the timeline added a bend no one expected. A final routine message went by voice. A handoff between airspaces should have followed. Instead, routine data feeds thinned and then stopped, and a simple line on a controller's screen failed to appear where it should. From that instant onward, the story split in two: the route the flight should have flown, and the absence that took its place. Viewers will hear what is known down to the minute and the mile, what remains unanswered, and what those gaps have changed about how oceans are searched and skies are watched. The clock matters. Time is the straightest ruler in this story. The jet left Kuala Lumpur a little before 1 a.m. local time on March 8, 2014, climbed to cruising altitude, and settled into the lane that points toward the Vietnamese coast. Communications rolled out on schedule, position reports, altitude confirmations, and the expected short exchanges between flight deck and air traffic control. The last voice heard from the cockpit was calm, an acknowledgement to controllers as the flight approached a navigation point where one unit of airspace passes a plane to the next. After that voice, the flight's transponder, its identity badge in the sky, stopped replying. On a radar screen that watches cooperative aircraft, the call sign faded. On primary radar, which simply sees moving objects without needing their badge, a target remained. Where a controller expected to see the jet continue into Vietnamese airspace, the expected call-in did not arrive. The gap began there, at a handoff point that should have been forgettable. Controllers on both sides of the handover started the standard process. Call, wait, call again. Ask neighboring centers if they had the flight. Check alternate frequencies. Query other aircraft on the route. Early in any unusual event, there is always a window where people assume a technical hiccup will fix itself. That window matters at sea, where minutes turn into miles. In those minutes, the target that didn't cooperate on civilian screens showed behavior on different scopes that suggested a turn back across the peninsula. Military radar, which can track targets without transponder replies, later indicated a heading swing that pointed the aircraft back toward Malaysian airspace and then out over the Strait of Malacca. This was not what a controller would expect to see in the first hour of an overnight flight to Beijing. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with ocean stories whenever you want. The narrative continues in the same breath, because the night did not pause for anyone to catch up. The silence in routine channels opened a lane for a second kind of evidence. Radar that watches everything that moves, not just the flights that check in. Those returns suggested a path bending left, tracing near waypoints commonly used in regional navigation, and then pushing along the strait toward the northwest. The track crossed peninsular skies and passed near familiar place names, a city coastline here, a shipping lane there, before the primary radar returns themselves thinned. That is the first hard curve in the story. The route the jet should have flown versus the route a radar recorded without the usual electronic name tag attached. When people talk about a turnback, the mind wants to jump to motives. Careful narration resists that jump. It stays with what lines and times can actually show. A turn that references known waypoints suggests that someone or something selected a path the aircraft could follow without visible drama. Whether a pilot turned a knob, a system flew a stored path, or some mix of both unfolded, is beyond what the early data alone can prove. What can be said without loading more meaning than the data can carry? Is this a large transport jet? Went from standard route to an unexpected track. It did so while dropping out of the cooperative picture seen by civilian controllers. And for a stretch of that night it flew where it was not expected to be. The first full day after any disappearance is a tight maze of handovers, calls, and map boxes drawn on water. In the early hours, search efforts followed where a routine failure would have left a plane somewhere along the original path toward the South China Sea. Aircraft and vessels looked in the wrong water, because at first no one had put the radar indications of a turn together with the wider absence. International handovers between controllers, between search and rescue regions, between agencies with different tools, always bring a learning curve. The cost of confusion at sea is distance. A search box sketched over one patch of water is energy and daylight that does not cover another. In those first 24 hours, searchers were still looking forward, while a second line of evidence would soon say the trail bent and ran a very different way. That second evidence stream came from a place few viewers expected: the satellite that listened for the plane's communications link. Airliner radios and satellite units don't only talk when crew send messages. They also run small "Are you there?" exchanges, handshakes that confirm a terminal is still alive. In this case, the aircraft's satellite communication system made a series of brief contacts with a geostationary satellite sitting high over the Indian Ocean. Each contact left behind two numbers that, when translated into simple terms, became the keys to a new map. One was about timing, how long the signal took to travel out and back. One was about frequency, how the motion of the aircraft and the conditions of the link shifted the tone of the signal. Engineers call the first burst timing offset and the second burst frequency offset. A viewer can think of them as a clock and a pitch pipe. The clock says how far in a circle's worth of possibility. The pitch says something about whether the aircraft was moving toward or away from the satellite along that circle. Those brief exchanges added up to a series of arcs, imaginary curves on the Earth's surface, where the aircraft could have been when each handshake occurred. They did not give a single dot. They offered a ring of potential dots for each moment. When analysts compared those arcs across the night, they found that the sequence favored a path leading away from Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean. The seventh and final major arc became the boundary that most search work revolved around. Where that arc crossed certain latitudes and ocean depths, the probabilities grew or lessened based on fuel endurance, winds aloft, and how large and fast the search systems could cover seafloor. Before those arcs reshaped the map, families wanted to know the simple human facts of who and what were aboard. The manifest listed passengers and crew, people from many countries on an overnight journey, parents, children, professionals, students. The cargo included ordinary long-haul items and some that drew attention in later reporting, such as batteries and perishables. Investigators weigh such details with care. A manifest tells what was loaded, not what failed. The narrator holds one line tight: respect for individuals and reliance on sources that were placed on record. The human dimension stands beside the technical reports, not beneath them. Fuel and performance set the ruler that measures how far any aircraft can go. A long-haul twin like this one carries enough fuel to reach Beijing with reserves and to deal with contingencies. In the frame of this story, that fuel becomes a countdown clock. Wings aloft, either help or hurt range, step climbs. Small increases in altitude as the aircraft burns off weight can change endurance by small margins. Speed selections change fuel burn. A little faster eats more fuel, a little slower stretches time. Using that family of facts, analysts bound the furthest endpoints along the satellite-derived arc, then shaped a corridor wide, at first narrowing as more assumptions were tested, where the aircraft most likely reached ocean, and then the end of its endurance. The corridor that took form ran into the southern Indian Ocean, a reach of water famous among mariners for long swells, few ships, and weather that can turn an easy day into a hard one without asking. The seventh arc was where the final handshake aligned with fuel limits and the geometry of that satellite link. Along that arc, search teams ranked segments by likelihood, using the timing and pitch clues, performance estimates, and the fact that aircraft systems, when starved of fuel, fail in particular patterns. Those patterns shape educated guesses about when a power loss would have caused the satellite unit to drop off, and after a moment of power returning from auxiliary sources, try to rejoin the network one last time. That final attempt added weight to the timeline and helped frame where along the arc the end likely came. Ocean topography then stepped in as a character of its own. The southern Indian Ocean is not flat at the bottom. It is a landscape of ridges, scarps, abyssal plains, and canyons. Searchers cannot simply look at the seafloor. They must map it, often for the first time at modern resolution, and then sweep it with sonar that can distinguish a smooth, natural slope from the angular shapes a large airframe can make when it reaches the bottom at speed. Depths stretch thousands of meters. The rough terrain throws sonar shadows. Underwater mountains and escarpments complicate coverage patterns and produce returns that have to be checked again from another angle to be sure. All of that means fewer square miles per day than the public might imagine, and a constant balance between speed, resolution, and verification. The tools of that hunt form a small fleet. Pinger locators that listen for the acoustic beacons attached to flight recorders. Towed side-scan sonar systems that paint grayscale images of the bottom. And autonomous underwater vehicles, AOVs, that can dive deep and carry their sensors close to the terrain. Pinger locators have a clock built into their usefulness. Recorder beacons are designed to transmit at a set frequency for a set number of days. If searching starts late, that window narrows. Even within the window, false positives happen. A survey ship might hear a sound at the right frequency that turns out to be a natural source or a reflection. Towed sonar can cover wide lanes but must hold steady in rough seas. AOVs can trace fine detail but need time to run their lines and return with data. Less from each false alarm sharpen the next pass. Go back, crosshatch, and let the data decide. When the seafloor held its silence, the ocean surface eventually spoke. Years after the night of the disappearance, beachcombers and local officials found aircraft fragments along Indian Ocean shores and islands. The most famous of these, a large control surface called a flaperon, washed up on Réunion Island. Other pieces, sections of interior paneling, parts of wing fairings, and additional control surface fragments showed up on beaches in Madagascar, Mozambique, and along African coasts. Each fragment carried clues, serial numbers, and maintenance marks tied some pieces directly to the missing aircraft. Construction details and paint layers helped confirm others. The mix of parts, many from control surfaces, suggested a breakup consistent with a high-energy entry into water rather than a low-speed ditching. Yet even these pieces, with all their power to confirm identity and narrow timelines, could not draw a single dot on a map for the origin. They could only say that the ocean had carried them far. Ocean drift science stepped forward to turn those fragments into a kind of backwards clock. Currents in the Indian Ocean follow broad seasonal patterns. Winds add a push, and the shape and buoyancy of each object give it more or less sail to catch that push. Modelers ran simulations that dropped virtual debris near different points along the seventh arc and let currents and winds move those pieces for months and years. They then compared where the models said the debris would land with where it actually went ashore. The process is never precise. It offers a spread of probabilities, a sense that the origin likely lay on one reach of the arc rather than another. The ocean also added biological clocks. Marine growth on the fragments, especially colonies of goose barnacles, preserved a quiet record of water temperatures and ages. By reading the size and species of the barnacles and comparing that growth to known ocean temperature bands, scientists framed how long the debris had been afloat and in what waters it had traveled. Once evidence from radar, satellite handshakes, debris, and ocean models took their places, the discussion turned to structured comparisons of the leading hypotheses. A calm way to do that is to build an evidence matrix. List a scenario, list the points that fit it, List the points that contradict it, and list what remains unknown. One scenario controlled flight into a long, quiet run until fuel exhaustion matches the sequence of satellite handshakes and the eventual silence after many hours. It fits well with a steady track down to the Southern Ocean and an end near the last handshake, with the caveat that the final minutes could still hold motion that changed the exact impact point. A second, an onboard event that injured or incapacitated those in control, leaving the aircraft to fly on autopilot until the fuel ran out. Fits the long duration and a lack of routine communications, but must explain how the turnback and the track across the peninsula occurred. A third, a fire or smoke event, brings up questions about which systems would fail and in what order, and whether the aircraft could remain airborne for the many hours the satellite data cover. A fourth, unlawful interference has to be weighed against the public record without assigning accusation beyond what evidence can support. In each case, the matrix enforces discipline. Pro, contra, unknowns, what's supported, what's weak, what's contradicted by the data already published. The narrator keeps that grid visible in words, not as drama but as method. End of flight dynamics add one more layer to the picture. If an aircraft flies on until fuel exhaustion, engines flame out near simultaneously or in sequence. Autopilot modes can hold altitude until power is no longer available. Then the nose lowers into descent. Some models suggest oscillations, phugoid motions, where the aircraft pitches up and down as it trades height for speed without engine thrust. A high-energy impact would scatter distinct signatures on sonar, larger pieces separated by distances, fields of smaller debris spreading down current on the seafloor. A lower-energy ditching attempt might leave a different pattern. The sonar images searched and studied so far have not returned a confirmed airframe, which keeps this section in the realm of expectations and comparisons, rather than conclusions. Still, it prepares the viewer to understand what search teams look for in the grayscale of the deep. Media narratives and internet theories filled the years since the disappearance with claims that traveled faster than evidence. A measured guide helps audiences hold their footing. Primary documents, the official factual reports, raw data summaries, satellite logs, deserve more weight than summaries and commentary. Claims that cannot point to a source on record are entertainment at best. Small errors, once repeated, can grow into sturdy-sounding myths. A healthy habit is to ask, what would have to be true for this claim to be true? Does it align with the timeline? Does it fit the handshakes? Does it survive a map? Families and communities changed the tempo of the search more than once. Next of kin pressed for transparency, for the release of data, and for renewed searches when official efforts paused. Advocacy kept the subject from drifting completely out of view. Long-duration uncertainty does its own kind of harm. Answers matter for reasons beyond blame. They matter for closure, for safety lessons, and for a shared sense that mysteries at sea are investigated with patience, not left as permanent gaps in memory. Respect for that human dimension threads through every technical paragraph in this story. Inside the mosaic of nations and agencies, international coordination and politics shape what gets shared and when. Different states control different pieces of the map: airspace, search regions, satellite data, military radar. Jurisdiction crosses borders. Releasing data sometimes risks revealing methods that agencies are not eager to discuss in public. The record that exists in open view is a compromise between the need for transparency and the realities of how different systems gather information. It is fair to acknowledge that, and it helps a viewer understand why some lines are crisp while others remain sketched. In the years after the disappearance, aviation made changes that trace back to the night the routine broke. Global initiatives for distracking took shape to reduce gaps when an aircraft deviates from plan. Position reporting norms tightened over oceanic airspace, encouraging more frequent check-ins through multiple channels. Concepts for streaming limited sets of flight data during anomalies moved from white papers to trials. Not every idea has become universal practice. Cost, bandwidth, and privacy concerns still define what's implemented. But the line from a mystery over water to improvements in how that water is watched is clear. Even after arcs, fragments, and search seasons. Honest sentences remain that begin with "we still don't know." Without a wreck site and its recorders, the precise route choices minute by minute, the cockpit timeline in the first hour, and the exact chain of causes will stay in the column of open questions. Among the unknowns, some matter more for safety than others. Knowing whether systems failed in a certain order can change training. Knowing who did what, when can stay in the realm of history, until solid evidence brings it into focus. Prudence separates curiosity from the lessons that change procedures. If the wreck were found tomorrow, a playbook would open. First, secure the site and document it before anything is moved. Next, recover the flight recorders with chain of custody procedures that hold up to technical and public scrutiny. Then begin the careful process of mapping debris, identifying parts, and building the sequence backward from the end. Analysis would take months. Public reporting would come in stages. Definitive answers would likely emerge slowly, as fragments of timeline, system behavior, and structural evidence lock together. The ocean keeps secrets, but it also keeps records for those who arrive with the right tools and the right patience. The closing note is measured on purpose. The strongest supports in the evidence today point to a long flight away from the original route, a late set of satellite exchanges that end along a southern arc, an ocean entry that scattered enough fragments to ride currents for years, and a seafloor that has not yet yielded the main wreckage. The gaps that remain are not invitations to declare. They are invitations to keep working. The value in this story is not in a theory that wins the internet for a day. It's in the steady method that turned a blank piece of ocean into a map, turned handshakes into arcs, and turned washed-up fragments into a trail of facts. The ocean keeps secrets, but not forever, not against patient eye. The night track that followed did not behave like a short-lived glitch. It unfolded across real geography at the speed and altitude of a long-range jet. The primary returns that later came to light showed a path from the South China Sea back over peninsular terrain, a thread that seemed to pass near waypoints crews use every day. To an eye trained on en route charts, the bends resembled choices a flight management system could make if asked to step through known fixes, or choices a pilot could dial in with calm hands. No one outside the cockpit can say which hand, human or automatic, made those selections. What stands solid is the picture of a wide body not where it should be, moving with purpose through the night air lanes that crisscross the region, and then pushing out over darker water where island lights grow thin and the radar that saw everything eventually saw nothing. Controllers and coordinators moved through the standard ladder of responses. Call neighboring sectors. Query aircraft already in the sky. Do you have Malaysian at your 12 o'clock? Ask centers north and east whether a handoff came in late. Respect the fact that long-haul crews sometimes call on one frequency while listening on another. Let a few minutes pass because aviation, like the ocean, has rhythms that hiccup and then smooth out. In this case, those minutes stacked into hours, and those hours defined where ships and patrol aircraft went first. The early boxes, the ones sketched toward where the flight should have been, went to the South China Sea and nearby waters, because if an aircraft loses systems and descends suddenly, the most likely accident zone is where it last checked in. That assumption is healthy in 99 out of 100 cases. Here it sent hulls and wings to water that did not hold the truth. The turnback line emerging from primary radar asked search planners to pivot, and pivots at sea take time. Airspace handovers, national boundaries, and search and rescue regions do not sit on the same maps. They overlap like clear sheets placed on a table, each with its own lines and labels. When an event crosses those lines, everyone involved must update the shared picture. That updating eats daylight. Helicopters with short legs find themselves at the edge of their comfortable range. Fixed-wing aircraft can go farther, but not forever at the low speeds needed for close visual search. Ships can linger as long as fuel and food allow, but they move at the pace of ships, not jets. The cost of a late pivot is not measured in fault. It is measured in square miles missed. That first day, the sea keeps score with distance. In the middle of that first day maze, a second kind of evidence was already humming. Somewhere over the Indian Ocean, high above the equator, a geostationary satellite watched and listened. The aircraft's satellite unit had not been sending passenger messages or airline data across the night, but it was still alive in the simplest sense. When a network pinged to ask, "Are you there?" the unit blinked back. Those exchanges, heartbeats, really, leave behind two small clues that, when translated in plain words, become powerful. The first clue is how long each heartbeat took to go up to space and back down. Distance is time multiplied by speed, and radio waves in empty space travel at a speed that engineers know to too many decimal places. Add a small correction for the satellite's bent path down a coaxial cable, and a handful of predictable equipment delays, and what remains is a clean measurement of how far the aircraft was from the satellite's ear at the moment of each handshake. The second clue is how much the pitch of that heartbeat shifted. If a car passes by with music playing, the note bends toward the listener as the car approaches and slides lower as it goes away. That is the Doppler effect, and radio waves carry it just like sound does. In SATCOM logs, the amount of shift from the expected tone says whether the airplane was moving toward or away from the satellite along that ring of equal distance, and how fast. Engineers gave those two clues technical names: burst timing offset, the clock piece; burst frequency offset, the pitch piece. The names do not matter as much as the picture they build. Each clock value lays down a big circle on the map where the airplane could have been at that instant. The pitch value leans the picture this far from the satellite, moving to or fro at a certain rate. Take several handshakes across the night, draw several circles. Let the pitch nudge the mind toward one arc of each circle instead of the opposite one. Let fuel, speed, and the history of similar flights narrow which parts of those circles are even possible. A corridor appears, then a slender lane, then a ribbon running down into lonely water. It is not a single point because the satellite was not a tracker. It was a clock and a pitch pipe. But the ribbon is more than rumor. It gave ships a place to go. Let's go step by step, because the strength of that ribbon rests on simple ideas stacked carefully. Imagine the Earth as a ball, and the satellite as a point far above the equator that does not move in the sky. At any instant, every place that is the same distance from that satellite lies along a curve. If the plane is somewhere on that curve and talks to the satellite again an hour later from a different curve, and again an hour after that from yet another curve, then the path must cross those curves in an order that makes sense for the plane's speed, fuel, and winds aloft. The late-night handshakes formed a sequence that moved steadily away from Southeast Asia. By the last handshake, the distance from the satellite, the direction implied by the Doppler shift, and the time the engines could reasonably have run all squeezed the options down to a southern reach of ocean that merchant captains call empty, even when they are in the middle of it. Winds aloft matter more than casual readers might guess. At cruise height, wind fields vary by season and latitude. A headwind steals range, a tailwind donates miles. Step climbs. The small rises in altitude. Crews make as fuel burns off and the aircraft grows lighter. Trim fuel burn and can add precious minutes at the end of a transoceanic run. If the evening's winds gave, say, a slight push down a southwest lane, the possible endpoints march farther along the arc than they would with a strong headwind. If crews on other nights flying similar lanes recorded a common wind profile for that month, those profiles become a sanity check on where to put the high-confidence tiles on a search grid. Watch out for this. Stick too hard to any one wind model and the map grows false confidence. Good analysts cross-check winds from different sources and run sensitivities. What if the wind was 15 knots faster out of the quarter tonight? Until the corridor looks like a band with soft edges, not a knife cut. Fuel is a clock wearing a mask. A long-haul twin leaves with enough for the route, its reserves, and the contingencies a dispatcher and captain plan for. Holds, diversions, weather, traffic. As the route changes, that budget changes. Higher speed is a rush that burns more. Lower speed stretches time, but time is not range. If the air is against you, by the hours where only satellite handshakes spoke, the airplane had flown long enough that only modest changes in speed could alter the end. By big distances, a bit faster early, a bit slower late, a crosswind that arrived 30 minutes earlier than forecast. Each adds or subtracts dozens of miles. No one knew the exact blend, but all the credible blends ended near that seventh curve. The seafloor along that curve is not friendly to quick answers. Ridges bulk up out of abyssal plains like the bones of an old sleeping animal. Escarpments drop into black cuttings that are deeper than mountains are tall. Side scan sonars love flat floors. Shadows fall predictably. Targets stand proud. On slopes and in gullies, shadows hide shape and slope fools the eye. Towed systems must be far enough off the bottom to avoid snagging their fish on high ground, yet close enough to paint fine detail that distinguishes a wing spar from a rock seam. Autonomous vehicles can fly nearer, but they need plans that keep them safe and leave time to run lanes twice at different headings, so bright ghosts vanish and real objects stay. A team can cover hundreds of square miles a week in friendly terrain with good weather. Put a storm in the frame or run into fields of rough basalt, and the coverage rate collapses. The maps built for this search became gifts with a value beyond one case. They filled blank patches on charts thousands of miles from any land and will guide cables, science, and ships for years. Hunt tools come with limits that honest voices lay out as part of the story, not as an apology. Locator beacons on recorders chirp a steady tone for a set life on purpose. It focuses ears when it matters most, and forces searchers to move fast while the trail is warm. By the time the corridor swung south, the chirp window had narrowed. Ships still listened. Seas still had their own music. Tones can echo in odd ways around seafloor features, producing confident lines on a spectrogram that later turn out to be geology, not hardware. Teams return to the same patch from the opposite direction to make the false tones cancel out, the way a sound engineer moves a microphone to kill a hum. Towed sonar writes pictures in grayscale that the human eye reads better than any algorithm after a team has looked at hundreds of miles of nothing and seen the few somethings. AUVs for fine work are more like careful photographers than casual tourists. They must move slowly to resolve the smallest clues. That slowness is not delay. It is the price of clarity. When the ocean finally returned pieces, the pieces carried both identity and ambiguity. A flabron, the trailing surface on a wing that helps an aircraft land and take off, came ashore on a volcanic island in the western Indian Ocean more than a year after the night in question. Its shape and structure were distinctive. Its internal markings lined up with production records, other parts interior panels with placards, a section of fixed wing trailing edge with maintenance marks, pieces of engine cowling washed up on African coasts and island beaches where currents and winds naturally herd flotsam. Each piece proved the absence of the whole better than any sentence could. Each suggested forces at the end, water grabbing and twisting parts that break free early in a violent entry or tear away as the fuselage meets the sea. But even a dozen pieces are not a compass. They are messengers that say, yes, this airplane reached the Indian Ocean, and yes, its encounter with the surface had energy and little more. Oceanographers turned debris into math that the public could carry. A foam panel with edges rounded by a year of waves catches wind differently than a dense flaperon with internal cavities. Barnacled surfaces ride lower, smooth ones skate higher. The Indian Ocean's gyres draw lines that a bottle or a seed or a slat would follow unequally in different seasons. Reverse drift modeling respects those facts. Modelers start rafts of virtual fragments from candidate points along the last handshake, and let months unroll, with wind fields and currents pulled from reanalyses of weather and ocean data for that year. When the virtual pieces emerge where real ones did, those start points earn trust. When they do not, those starts fall to the bottom of the list. The result is not a bullseye. It is a heat map. In that map, the warmest colors sat on the Ark's southern reaches more often than not. The quietest detectives in this story were the barnacles. Goose barnacles settle on floating objects and build their calcium houses with a growth pattern that whispers the temperatures they have lived in. Ocean temperature bands run like latitudes through water. A marine biologist can look at the size and growth rings on a colony and say roughly how long it has been at sea and in what temperature ranges it spent most of that time. Combine that biological clock with drift models, and a picture emerges of fragments traveling thousands of kilometers along predictable highways. The picture is not a map pin, but it is enough to say that the corridor's southern tiles, not its northern end, fit the sea's handwriting better. Viewers always ask, what happened in the last minutes? Because that is where human attention goes. Engineers ask too, but with different nouns. Autopilot modes govern much of long-haul flight. Different modes behave differently when engines lose fuel. One mode will hold altitude until it cannot, then let the nose fall to maintain speed. Another might command a gentle descent. Without thrust, an airplane can glide, but a big transport at cruise altitude gliding, without human inputs, can enter an oscillation. Nose down to gain speed, climb a little as it trades that speed for height, slow again, then dip. That phugoid rhythm can continue until the airframe meets the sea. On radar, that would draw a shallow sawtooth. On an AUV's sonar, the aftermath could appear as a spread of debris over a fan-shaped area, rather than a tight cluster. A controlled ditching would draw a smaller scar. The seafloor surveyed so far shows no scar that both systems and human eyes have endorsed as a match. That keeps the final minutes as a set of likely motions rather than a single storyline. It is tempting to give the microphone to the loudest voices online, but the documentary tone favors a different habit. Show how to weigh claims, then let viewers practice. A claim that contradicts the satellite arcs must either disprove the timing and pitch math, or invent a failure in the logs and then explain how debris reached the Indian Ocean on schedule. A claim that puts the aircraft in a hangar must erase the public record of serial-numbered fragments on beaches and reconcile that erasure with dozens of independent finders. A claim that reads a single radar scope differently than the center that ran it must account for why the people who work those scopes would accept being corrected by strangers looking at second-hand screenshots. The rule of thumb that helps here is short. The closer a claim sits to primary data, official timelines, raw logs, physical fragments, the heavier it should feel in a hand. The farther it travels from those sources, the lighter it should feel, and the easier it should be to set it down. Families who waited did not set anything down. They organized, asked for records, demanded new searches, and turned patience into a kind of action. A parent on camera did not shout. The parent said, "Please keep looking. Please tell us everything you can." An advocate who became fluent in satellite basics spoke to rooms that had never learned those words and made arcs and handshakes livable. A community in a coastal town that later found a fragment held a small ceremony before the piece moved into the chain of custody, because people do that when the ocean returns a message with salt on it. The emotional truth that threads through the technical chapters never asks for noise. It asks for respect and time. International coordination looks straightforward on paper and complicated across time zones. One state holds the flag of registry. Another state owns the waters where a corridor runs. A third state fields satellites. Other states send survey ships, sonar teams, and analysts. Aviation agencies share procedures and past cases. Law enforcement, intelligence services, and militaries hold certain kinds of data tighter than a public conversation would like. The result is a record made of different styles, voices, and levels of detail. A patient narrator tells viewers that this patchwork is not a conspiracy. It is the seam line where institutions meet. It is fair to say that the seams could be stitched faster and straighter. It is wiser to show how, after early hesitations, ships went, maps were made, and methods improved. Those methods did not go back into drawers when a search paused. They moved into policy. Global distress tracking, the simple idea that a flight in trouble should be easier to find anywhere on Earth, took a firmer shape. Over oceanic airspace, position reports grew more frequent and more diverse. moving through multiple channels so that a failure in one data path does not silence the whole picture. Concepts for streaming slices of flight data, recorder values in abnormal events left conference rooms and entered trials. The balance between bandwidth, cost, and privacy still sits on desks, but the direction of travel is easy to see. Fewer gaps, sooner alerts, and more ways to keep a trustworthy track on aircraft that deviate from plan. Quick fact: even a single arc built from a late handshake changes a search from everywhere to somewhere. And in the ocean somewhere is a miracle. Another quick fact: everywhere along that arc, sea state and bottom topography change search math in ways that do not translate well to headlines. A swath that looks narrow on a map can take weeks of ship time to cover with confidence. That is why families pressed for renewed searches when new probability maps highlighted narrow bands with better odds. Given finite resources, the right choice is not search forever. The right choice is search where the odds and the tools and the season line up to make time mean something. The evidence matrix that keeps the leading hypotheses from becoming teams in a game is worth revisiting at a granular level, because a viewer's mind appreciates neat shelves. Consider the long, controlled flight to fuel exhaustion scenario. Pro matches the duration implied by handshakes, aligns with a steady, southbound corridor, consistent with a final log-on attempt that fits a power-down, power-up cycle, typical of engine flameouts and an auxiliary power unit picking up the load briefly. Contra must explain the initial route change and the drop of cooperative signals without flinching. Must also square with debris types that suggest a high-energy entry inconsistent with an extended, textbook ditching. Unknowns, cockpit decisions, exact mode selections, and whether any manual input occurred near the end. Now take an onboard incapacitation scenario, such as a depressurization that left the cabin and cockpit unresponsive. Parco fits the long, uncommunicative flight, and the lack of routine check-ins could in some variants allow a pre-programmed route segment to explain the turnback and waypoint-like behavior. Contra must fit observed altitude changes across the peninsula without pilot action. Must reconcile with the time span, many hours during which some systems would have behaved differently if pressurization had been lost early. Unknowns, whether any oxygen system behaviors would have left traces that could reach the satellite log or be inferred from the route. A fire or smoke scenario earns its place because cargo and electrical faults always get a careful look. Prue explains a crew's possible urge to turn back toward a large airport, offers a path for communications to cease if smoke invaded compartments or prompted crews to pull certain breakers. Contra must still fit a flight that lasted through many hours of clean satellite handshakes, implying systems that remained powered and a structure that remained flyable for far longer than most onboard fire events allow. Must explain the quiet that followed the turnback rather than a pattern of emergency descents and attempts to land. Unknowns, exact cargo behavior, wiring conditions, and whether any progressive failure could have produced the observed arc sequence without human inputs after the first turn. Unlawful interference scenarios vary in their details and implications, and a careful narrator gives them the same matrix without extending beyond the public record. Prue can account for route changes, and a long, silent flight can be reconciled with quiet arcs if control remained deliberate. Contra must align with the absence of credible claims of responsibility, the lack of demands, and the fragment trail that points to a high-energy ocean end rather than a concealed landing. Must be weighed against comprehensive background checks and investigations that did not publicly support accusations against specific individuals. Unknowns, motives, means, and any evidence that would require access to recorders or wreckage to confirm or deny. The point of this shelving exercise is not to crown a winner. It is to keep the conversation honest, while acknowledging that different people will weight the same shelf differently. That is allowed. What matters is that the shelves stay stocked with facts, not fear. In the long shape of the story, the human level rises again when the work pauses. Families do not pause. A spouse stands at a microphone, and in a voice that never cracks, asks search leaders to meet one more time, to share the latest charts. A child who has become an adult in the years between handshakes attends a public forum and asks a scientist, if the barnacles say warm water, how far south does that put the debris early on? A community sets a bench by the sea with names carved into it, not because a ceremony answers questions, but because a place to sit and look at water helps. When the camera leaves and the benches stay, the ocean still moves. That movement is part of the story too. The record of coordination between states deserves a few sentences tuned for viewers who are new to the way search and rescue works. Each ocean is divided into regions where particular nations lead EID/SAA response. Those leads can change when evidence moves an event across lines. The state of registry leads the investigation but often appoints or partners with others for operational work. One state brings sonar assets, another brings analysts who have mapped 1,000 miles of ridge, another brings an aircraft that can sit 10 hours over a grid and fly ruler straight tracks. Meetings smell like coffee and printer toner, and most of the talk uses verbs like assign, update, and verify. It is slow theater a viewer never sees. It is how boxes on a map turn into wet decks, tired eyes, and gigabytes of bottom pictures that few will ever view and that might someday at one dot hold the answer. Changes since the disappearance have a simple shape, fewer blind corners. Satellites that listen for position reports do so more often. Certain alerts fire when tracks deviate too far from filed paths. Controllers in oceanic airspace receive shorter intervals between automated check-ins. Ideas to stream targeted slices of data, say a handful of parameters that would help searchers find an aircraft that did not arrive. Sound straightforward until someone counts the number of flights, the cost of bandwidth, and the need to avoid choking networks with noise on normal days. Progress is real and imperfect. The compass needle points where it should, earlier awareness, more resilience to single-point failures, and stronger habits around sharing key data across borders when the unexpected happens. The unknowns that remain are both small and huge. Small, because the shape of the long flight, the southern arc, and the debris trail are all strong constraints. Huge, because from a safety perspective, knowing the cockpit timeline and system states would let training and procedures absorb lessons cleanly. The difference matters. If a procedure failed, cruise when seconds mattered, that is worth rewriting worldwide, even if the rest of the chain was unique. If a person's choices drove the route, that is part of history and accountability, but not always a direct lever for changing how systems behave on future nights. A careful script keeps those categories apart while giving each its due. In the absence of recorders, searchers still build playbooks. If a wreck were found tomorrow, the first hour would be for protection. Mark the coordinates, secure the site, notify the right authorities with legal responsibilities. The first day would be for documentation. Photograph the field, map clusters, identify the areas where recorders most likely rest. The first weeks would be for recovery and custody. Lift the recorders, package them in a way that preserves every trace. Move them to labs where teams who have done this many times will handle them in rooms that hum at a certain quiet frequency. Families would be told in private before cameras roll. Public reports would come not as a single thunderclap, but as a series of smaller precise sounds. We have the recorders, we have read the memory, we are analyzing the traces in the final minute. Here is what we can say today. Here is what we will say when tests now underway are complete. That series would not satisfy appetite for instant certainty. It would satisfy the much older appetite for answers that last. Across all of these chapters, the tone stays level because the ocean does not reward noise. A wide body went where it should not, then out where far water becomes its own country. A handful of handshakes that no one expected to matter became the backbone of a world's worth of calculations. Search ships dragged instruments across ridges no one had measured so closely before, and painted the first pictures of seafloor that had only ever been numbers on an old chart. People on beaches found plastic and composite and metal that turned out to be pieces of the long night everyone remembered. Families taught officials how to sit with uncertainty without letting the subject fade from public life. Engineers and controllers used one scar to improve how the next wound might be treated. Inside that long arc of patience, small stories grew. A technician who learned to read Doppler graphs like a favorite song. A helmsman who stared at nothing on a grayscale screen until his eyes watered, and then trained a hand to notice what a machine missed. A teacher who turned arcs and clocks into a classroom activity because a 13-year-old asked, "How do we find something the ocean doesn't want us to see?" The script keeps that warmth because viewers feel the difference between a chase and a vigil. A chase wants a villain. A vigil wants light. This subject keeps asking for light. Measured, fair, steady. It is the kind of light a museum gallery uses on an old map so that every crease and ink line shows. It does not glare. It invites. The most patient work in the story took place far from cameras, in rooms where maps lay under plastic and pens slid across them. Slowly, engineers revisited the satellite handshakes so many times that the curves felt familiar like a coastline. Each review had the same goal: remove any tiny bias that might nudge the corridor too far north or south. Temperature inside the airplane's avionics bay changes delay by a hair. A satellite's slow drift over years changes geometry by a hair. Even ground equipment clocks age into tiny offsets. Those hairs add up if no one combs them. They were combed. Independent groups ran the same math with their own assumptions and checked each other. When techniques agreed despite being different, confidence rose. When results diverged, the differences became experiments. The method was slow, not because the math was hard, but because the ocean punishes haste with wrong boxes drawn in the wrong place. A small but telling scene helps people feel what method means. On a research ship, working one of the corridor tiles, a sonar operator sat through the gray of a full watch as the screen crawled by, blank, 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 then printed a shape with angles where nature prefers curves. Heart sped for a moment. The supervisor said nothing dramatic. The supervisor said, "Mark, turn, run back the other way." The crew did. The second pass erased the angles. The bright spot was an echo from a slope. The first pass had struck at a perfect trick angle. The erasure disappointed everyone for a minute and pleased them for a lifetime, because it proved again that only a target that holds from two directions deserves the word contact. A second scene belongs with the first. On a beach that faces far water, a villager lifted a curved piece of composite out of wrack and weed. Officials were called, a small circle formed, and the ocean stood a few meters away, flat as a plate and opaque as a secret. A child asked the simplest question: "Is this the plane?" The official answered with the simplest truth: "It looks like a part of that kind of plane." The piece went into a chain of custody. Later, in a lab, technicians wiped salt off markings that matched records, and a clerk typed a line that joined a list of lines. The list did not solve a map. It confirmed a path. The path mattered. The story's middle years gathered many such moments, each small and precise, and together they set a tone that viewers can trust. A mystery as large as an ocean tempts anyone to grab at noise. This case trained many to let noise pass. The clean habit looks like this. If a claim cannot point to a line in a public record or a fragment on a table, set it aside. If a loud voice says the satellite data are wrong, ask which timing, which frequency, which correction. If a rumor claims a landing somewhere other than the Southern Ocean, ask how the debris arrived in time and with the right growth. If a new radar appears as a screenshot, ask who pulled the file when and what the sender that owned the scope says about it. The sea forgives honest questions and ignores certainty without proof. Meanwhile, in aviation offices and conference halls, the case changed the way people think about tracks. Space-based listening grew from a promise into a network. Receivers flying on satellites began to hear the automatic position broadcasts that aircraft already send. Even when those aircraft cruise over the most remote ocean, controllers in oceanic airspace now see more dots, More often, distress tracking rules firmed up. Agreements that a flight that goes off script should trip alerts sooner, and that long gaps in automated reports are no longer acceptable on certain routes. Consider it the sky's version of a buddy system. Ideas about streaming small slices of flight data during anomalies moved through pilot groups, regulators, and airlines. The conversation matured past slogans into details. Which parameters, under what trigger, for how long, with what protections. The perfect remained the enemy of the good. The good improved anyway. One of the most understandable questions is the hardest to answer without recorders. What happened on the flight deck in the first hour? The case keeps respect with a line that does not bend. Without the recorders, anyone who speaks in detail about minute-by-minute actions at the controls speaks from imagination. It is fair to say that the turn across the peninsula looked like a sequence that could be flown by a modern aircraft with simple inputs. It is fair to say that systems became quiet in a way that removed the aircraft from cooperative surveillance. It is fair to say that no successful distress call reached controllers, and that no radio from the crew reported an emergency on record. Beyond those fair lines, prudence speaks softly. A map and a handful of handshakes do not write cockpit dialogue. That honesty protects both memory and method. Even with those limits, the case offers tangible safety lessons that needed no cockpit audio to be useful. Over water, redundancy now means diversity, as much as it means backups. Different paths for position data, not just two of the same kind. Alerting logic now favors notice sooner over assume it will fix itself, especially near handover points between regions. Flight operations departments in many airlines refresh crews on how to handle loss of communication scenarios so that any unusual step frequency changes, mode selections, squawk codes, stays muscle memory. Rescue coordinators rehearse the dance of handovers and maps with more urgency, so that the first hours of any future search carry less drift. Small changes add up where miles are the currency. The public often asks about the seventh arc, as if it were a single rope drawn across the ocean. The reality is both humbler and stronger. Each handshake painted a ring. The last handshake painted the last ring. The places where those rings make sense for the aircraft's time and fuel, combined with the way the frequency of each handshake slid up or down, gave a set of lanes, not a thread. Search plans weighed those lanes against weather windows, ship availability, and bottom roughness. If a viewer pictures a ribbon spread out on a kitchen table, with one end nearer to Australia and the other running down into colder water, the places searched most deeply were stretches of that ribbon where all the independent clues overlapped best. Pieces that returned from the sea told their own quiet stories of the end. A control surface broken free carries scars, fractured edges that read like seismograph lines to an engineer, scraped fairings that tell which way water grabbed first. Some parts showed a combination of bending and tearing consistent with a forceful entry. Others, like interior trim, told of a long float, sun-bleached and sea-rounded. The mix did not script the moment, but it argued against the gentlest possible scenario. That is why searchers still expect that when the wreck is found, it will not present as an intact fuselage floating like a capsule. It will present as a field, with heavier elements near the first hit and lighter parts spread like a shadow of the last winds and currents at the surface. The final minutes still sit inside a pocket of informed possibilities. If fuel exhaustion arrived under autopilot, with no human correction, a descent that began clean could have moved into a shallow repeating rise and fall, as the aircraft traded height for speed and back again, each cycle eating energy until sea level arrived. If a control input came late, conscious or not, it could have tightened the path or changed the angle. Both lines end in water. Both lines teach search teams what to look for. A long fan of debris for the first, a tighter cluster for the second. In both, the recorders, if recovered, would carry the sound and numbers that convert respectful inference into knowledge. Across years, media made and unmade stories with speed. The most useful voices learned to resist urgency that facts could not match. A rumor that blooms in a morning broadcast can die by sunset. When a primary document is read aloud and compared on screen, viewers learn the rhythm. A claim appears. A reporter asks for the primary source. An official points to the record. The claim shrinks or adapts. That rhythm, repeated 1,000 times, is how a scattered global audience learned to weigh sea mysteries the way navigators weigh weather by watching the trend, not the splash. At the center of the trend sit families who made memory a form of labor. Some organized independent drift studies and invited oceanographers to explain, modeling in words that anyone could carry. Some traveled to meetings where search leaders showed maps not yet published. Some asked for nothing more than that their loved ones' names not be reduced to acronyms. All of them made the case more than a technical exercise. A disappearance is not only a fact, it is a room where people must live for years. The narrating voice keeps returning to that room with the same calm it uses for the labs and the ships, because the rooms belong in the story as much as the maps do. International cooperation improved because the case made a weakness visible. A single nation cannot own all the tools. A single agency cannot run all the math. The most productive months came when the right assets met the right tiles in the right season. A survey ship with deep AUVs worked a rough patch in late summer, while a towed system covered broad lanes in calmer water, and a team ashore ran drift ensembles to recheck priorities in light of new debris. Coordination looked like a bulletin board covered in strings, but the strings represented contracts, weather windows, crew rotations, and diplomatic permissions. People who liked to see the world as neat grids had to make peace with the ocean's pulse. Because any long search raises the question of cost. The script acknowledges it gently. Money is fuel for ships and food for crews and air for planes, and hours for analysts. When a search pauses, it is not always a judgment on will. It can be a judgment on how to spend tools in a world with many needs. Here, families and advocates shaped the conversation by asking for revisits when new data nudged probabilities. Those nudges were not always dramatic. They did not need to be. A few % more likelihood in a narrower band can justify a season's return. This pragmatic tone, return where the odds sharpen, pause where they blur, kept hope practical. The question, what if the wreck is found tomorrow, returns one last time, not to tease, but to prepare minds for what method looks like after discovery. The first pictures would go only to the small circles that must make sure the site is documented without loss. The first statements would be thin and factual. A location, a confirmation, the words ongoing work. Weeks would pass while teams lifted recorders and scanned fields. Then a fact with weight would land. Data recovered. The data would not speak in one paragraph. They would speak in graphs and times and system states. Specialists would listen first, then the story would come back to the public in pages that explain without rushing. This is how aviation, with all its speed, has always handled its slowest and most important task. It is worth saying aloud what many think but sometimes tuck away. Uncertainty is hard. The ocean does not apologize for it. The people who work on water learn to hold it like a rope with slack, firmly, without trying to pull it into a straight line that will not come. Viewers can learn that grip too. A map with a corridor and a handful of curves is not a failure. It is a success compared to the blank that would have stood without satellite heartbeats and debris in hands. A search area measured in thousands of square miles is not a confession of ignorance. It is the correct size for the problem. When the bottom is unknown and the weather has its say, what remains unknown is clear and honest. The exact route choices, minute by minute across the peninsula and out over the strait, the precise mix of system states on the night the routine broke, the conversation on the flight deck in the first hour, the final minute's attitude, speed and angle, all sit behind a door that only the recorders can open. Among those, safety questions and historical questions overlap, but are not identical. Procedures can be strengthened, even while motives remain unproven. Tracking can be improved even if a single night's decisions are still a mystery. The ocean often gives enough to change the next voyage long before it gives everything about the last one. Because this story has lived for years, it also changed how people talk to children about hard subjects. In many homes, the case became a way to explain patience, evidence, and care. An adult could say, "Sometimes big things are not solved in a day. Sometimes we follow clues that are not the kind that appear in movies. Sometimes the ocean is quiet for a long time." A child could ask, "Does quiet mean nothing is happening?" The adult could answer, "No, it means people are working with calm hands." That exchange sits comfortably in the same gallery as discussions about barnacles and arcs, because all of it is about how humans meet a large, indifferent world with respect. The last reflections belong to the watchstanders and the mapmakers, the families and the beachcombers, the operators and the scientists, the controllers and the children who asked careful questions. A single flight went missing, and the world built a new set of habits in response. More eyes in the sky, more sharing across borders, more modesty about what the sea allows people to see at any given hour. The search drew broad swaths on maps, and those swaths turned into seafloor charts that will keep cables safe and guide research subs long after this case finds its ending. The fragments that washed ashore, carried by currents that have moved unbothered for ages, reminded people that the ocean's vastness is not empty. It is busy in ways too large for one camera frame. Measured conclusions. Feel right here. The evidence most strongly supports a long southbound flight that ended along a southern arc in the Indian Ocean, followed by a high-energy entry that scattered parts later recovered on distant shores. The satellite handshakes, when translated into plane geometry and tuned with care, point the way. The drift studies and the growth on fragments support the southern tiles. The search, while incomplete, has already cleared enormous seafloor, with eyes that never existed at that resolution before this case. What remains unknown matters. It is honest to say so without turning that honesty into a stage for invention. The ocean kept its secret through storms and seasons, but not without leaving prints, arcs on a map, tones in a log, scratches on a wing piece, a colony of barnacles that grew at the right temperatures for the right months. Those prints brought the world closer than vanished suggests. They offered enough to change rules and tools, to teach new habits, and to frame a corridor where answers still likely sleep. Patience and method remain the best lights. They are not as bright as certainty, but they last longer in bad weather. As the closing moment arrives, the narrator returns to the simplest image: a ship's bridge at night, a soft glow on instruments, a chart beside a mug, a pencil ready. Out beyond the bow, the sea rolls, indifferent and exact. Somewhere on its bottom, facts wait. People will go back again when the odds tighten and the tools match the season. Until then, those who look after the sky and the sea will keep the new habits. The families will keep asking well-framed questions. The engineers will keep combing the hairs out of the math. The ocean keeps secrets, but not forever. It yields to patience, to calm work, and to the kind of attention that treats every scrap as a story and every map as a promise.